Hello, welcome to the new team member training for Tier 1 PBS. If you are listening to this session, chances are pretty high that you are a brand new team member to an existing team on your school campus. The whole purpose of this module is to provide an overview for you for what your team had engaged in. They had participated in an intensive 3-day training to develop their school-wide PBS plan on your school campus. And so the purpose of this module is to help give you an overview of what they covered in those 3 days, to give you some background of some of the components that they've been implementing on your school campus, and then to help you understand how you can best support the team and to be an equal team member with the rest of the folks, even though you may not have participated in that intensive 3-day training with them. So to start off, let's talk first about positive behavior support, which is the application of evidence-based strategies, systems to assist schools to improve academic performance in order to help enhance school safety, decrease problem behavior, and to establish the positive school cultures. The objectives of when your team went through the original 3-day training, the goal was that they would understand PBS implementation within a multi-tiered system of support, which is also referred to as MTSS across the state. Having that global understanding of what the core principles are of PBS, which then leads to what are these characteristics of Tier 1 expectations and rules that have been implemented or you're struggling or working to implement on your school campus. And then helping to understand the rationale and guidelines for teaming, the role of being a PBS team member, how to teach behavior, the reward systems, using a problem-solving process for Tier 1 database decision-making issues around behavior, how to gain buy-in, and then becoming familiar with the data, the various data sources available for Tier 1 implementation. The Florida PBS project is funded through the Florida Department of Education and the Bureau of Exceptional Education and Student Services. And our mission is to increase the capacity of Florida school districts to use team-based planning and problem solving to implement PBS within MTSS. How we do that is to provide training and technical assistance free to the districts across the state in the development and implementation of PBS plans, starting first at the Tier 1 foundational level, then classroom, as well as Tier 2, which is also referred to as targeted group or supplemental supports, and that individual student level, also known as intensive and Tier 3 interventions. As of earlier this year, this is the districts that are shaded in the green category are districts that are active with our project, meaning they have an active district leadership team and they meet with us at least on an annual basis to review their district action plan, review the data, and help to come up with strategies to maintain, sustain, and possibly expand PBS supports within their district. The number of schools trained so far as of July of 2012 is almost 1,400 schools. And as you can see from this, we've trained everything from pre-K all the way through high schools, center alternative schools. So what's important to know with PBS is that it's not a curriculum or a package or a program, but that it's a process and a framework to help guide behavioral supports within a school campus. And it's going to be unique to the needs of your school. So Tier 1 PBS is that foundation of a multi-tiered system of support. It's adapted to fit your school. The great part of it is it coexists with most other school-wide programs. If you have something like character education, it fits nicely with that as an example. Consistent with research-based principles of behavior, helps to build the effective environment so that behavior is more conducive to learning, or that the environments are more conducive to learning overall. It focuses on that team-based collaborative approach. It's assessment-based, so it's going to use data to make decisions. And nationally, we have over 18,000 schools across the country that have been trained in implementing this, and almost 1,500 of those are in Florida alone, which is 78% of our districts and then almost 40% of our state schools. So let's start about the background of evidence-based practice. That we know that implementation of school-wide PBS leads to increased academic engaged time and enhanced academic outcomes. We also have data to show that children who fall behind academically will be more likely to find academic work aversive and also find escape maintain problem behaviors reinforcing. Viewed as outcomes, achievement and behavior are related. Views as causes of the other, achievement and behavior are unrelated. So what did this lead to? Well, we don't know what comes first, the behavior problem or the academic problem, but we do know for students that if you're experiencing one, whether it's academic or behavior, the other tends to follow or coincide simultaneously. So the Florida PBIS project a few years ago started to collaborate very closely with the problem-solving RTI project, both funded through the Florida Department of Education and both based at the University of South Florida, where the Florida PBS project focused on the behavior side, the PSRTI project focused on the academic side. And with this collaboration, merged the two into Florida's MTSS. So anything that we do collaboratively, you will see the logo under Florida's MTSS project here. This triangle talks about the continuum of supports. And when we're looking at applying a multi-tiered system of supports, the first thing we want to look at is applying a core curriculum for all students. And this is looking at setting up clear expectations and procedures intended for all students and staff across all settings across the entire campus. The goal is that all students would have access to this. This is your core curriculum. So if it's on the academic side, you would have the what is your core curriculum for teaching reading that all students access. For behavior, what would be the core curriculum that all students are being taught what the behavioral expectations are on campus. But we do know that sometimes students need a little bit more support. And for students that fall into this category are typically falling into the Tier 2 category, where they may need more supplemental interventions or supports in order to be successful on the school campus. One way for doing this is to provide these additional supports, and by doing this, we would fall into Tier 2 interventions. This tends to be up to about 15% of our students on our school campus. So they are still having access to the Tier 1 core curriculum, but they are also receiving additional support through possible pull-out groups, anger management, conflict resolution. And then there may be students that are still having difficulty, and through the Tier 1 supports, Tier 2 supports that they're receiving may not be enough, and they may need more individualized intensive supports that are geared around themselves. So these are considered these Tier 3 supports, which is typically at the top of the triangle, and it tends to fall no more than 5% of your school population. But what's important is that regardless of what level of intervention supports or levels of intensity that students might be receiving at Tiers 2 or Tiers 3, that they're still having access to the Tier 1 core curriculum on campus. And one way to determine if students are responding to the interventions that we set up is to engage in the problem-solving process, which involves defining the problem as step 1, analyzing the problem step 2, implementing the problem implementing strategies to address the problem behavior, and then evaluating or looking at, are the students responding to the intervention, is it working? This slide goes through, again, just some definitions that we just talked about. Also, as a reminder, if you would like the handouts for this presentation, you can download them directly. They're labeled at the bottom as new Tier 1 team member handouts, and you can download them directly to your computer and print them. Traditionally, when we're looking at discipline and problem behaviors that occur in a classroom, the #1 goal that we want to do is we want to stop that undesirable behavior. And unfortunately, it tends to happen through the use of punishment. But in order for undesirable behavior to occur, traditionally, we tend to wait for the problem behavior to occur. It catches our attention, we want it to stop. The downfall of that is that appropriate alternative behavior that a student can do instead of that problem behavior may not be addressed at that time. We actually can accidentally reinforce the problem behavior when it does occur. It moves in that reactive cycle, and we tend to remove students with frequent problems. When we're looking at a positive behavior support, the difference between PBS and traditional discipline is that it's looking at reducing undesirable behavior by altering the environments to prevent common problems. We want to prevent as much problems from occurring rather than waiting for them to occur and reacting. So therefore, we're going to teach what's expected. We're going to teach appropriate skills. When students display those appropriate skills, we're actually going to reward them or acknowledge them for exhibiting those expected behaviors that were just taught to them. And then we're systematically going to use our data to help identify appropriate supports for students that may not be responding well and may need more intensive or supplemental interventions. One of the first phases at the training that your team had engaged in is the teaming component, and it falls under the benchmarks of quality items 1 through 3. And I'll be talking to you a little bit about what the benchmarks of quality means in just a few minutes. When we're looking at the benchmarks of quality, the teaming is, like I said, the #1 critical element that is listed on there. And what's important to know is PBS is not a one-person approach, but that is a team-based approach, and that it is collaborative, and we've got a multidisciplinary team representing all your stakeholders on your campus. The team may be a subgroup for developing your behavior curriculum, designing and overseeing your Tier 1 interventions, helping to evaluate your progress, looking at the behavior data, and training your actual school teams or your school staff on campus. One thing that's pretty neat about this team process is that we actually have some data to show that higher functioning PBS teams have higher Tier 1 implementation scores. We have a long list of several years worth of data within the state of Florida in particular, in that schools that actually have high fidelity scores on the benchmarks of quality are actually realizing greater student outcomes. One example of that is that students that are implementing, or schools that are implementing with high fidelity, are actually having significantly less out of school, significantly less in school, significantly less office discipline referrals. But taking it a step further, if we look at higher functioning teams have higher implementation scores. So the more that we're able to work together as a team, the more likelihood we're going to have higher implementation scores, which then equates to greater student outcomes. We also set up as a team process, it's important to establish a team mission and goals. And this is one of the first activities that your team had completed. It should be listed on the front page of your action plan, which was the team roster, where they identified what's our team goals, what's our mission, what's going to be the purpose for us for coming together. Your team at the training may have also identified ground rules and how they can help support each other so that they can maintain effective collaboration across the school year. If they haven't done that already, this might be something that your team may want to investigate and actually spend a little time in doing this, and you can always talk to your PBS coach to assist you in this process. As you can see, these are the various team member roles that are available. A PBS coach and a team leader can be separate, but they could also be the same person as well. The PBS coach overall is to ensure that the teams are implementing with fidelity and to help gather the data that are required by the Florida PBS project 3 times annually. For a complete list and description of what the team member roles are, and if you are identified as one of these team members, you may want to refer to the miscellaneous section, page 1, in your training manual for more information. It's also important too is that when you're looking at team membership, that it's not only identifying folks, but it's actually examining the individual skills, strengths, and preferences of the individuals who could serve in those roles prior to finalizing team membership roles. It's also important too to note that there is flexibility in the assignments of the roles and that they could change throughout the year. And what's important to know is if they do change, that the new folks that are assuming these roles are very clear what the roles and responsibilities are, that this information is communicated to the rest of the team, that it's communicated to the rest of the faculty in case there is feedback that's provided from the faculty, they know who to go to across the school campus. Some of the guidelines for effective teaming are shared goals and responsibilities. There's transparency in actions. We're having clear quality communications amongst each other. There's trust between team members. There's a balanced task and process. One person is not taking everything on, but that there's equity in the tasks that are to be accomplished by that school team. Ruling by consensus, helping to resolve conflict constructively. Occasionally it does arise, but that it is able to be resolved constructively. Then that there is administrative support for the time and resources, and of course, as the team, they continue to have fun in the process and celebrate their accomplishments. As discussed with the benchmarks of quality that's completed annually by your school team and led by your coach to have this completed, the critical elements of Tier 1 PBS, as indicated by the research, fall under here. There are 10 main areas of the critical elements, and the training that it was designed, that your team went through, is designed around these critical elements. So all of the activities that they worked on and the different products that they developed are all addressing some level of these critical elements. This is what the school-wide benchmarks of quality scoring form looks like. This is something that eventually, like I said, at the end of the school year, your coach will be leading your team in the completion of the benchmarks of quality. And what's important from this is that we use these data to help identify low-scoring BOQ items so that it can be moved to a specific action plan, so we can identify what's the problem, what activities do we need to do to actually address the critical element and what we're struggling with, who's responsible, and then what's the timeline for completion. This is all located in the back of your training manual under the tab of Action Plan. Okay, so the next section of the critical element after teaming that your team worked with was expectations and rules. And this is actually setting up this core curriculum for behavior on your school campus. It's reflecting the school and community values, but the goal is that it's also going to support quality citizenship and your school's mission statement. So when we're looking at Tier 1 expectations, the definition of it is broad, positively stated behaviors that are desired of everyone, desired of staff, students, and families, but it needs to be aligned with that school's mission statement. Examples of what Tier 1 expectations may be are to be respectful, be responsible, be peaceful, be problem solvers. Then it leads to what do these expectations look like in these particular settings. And we refer to these as the rules for unique settings. So if you want students to be respectful, what would be respectful look like in the cafeteria? What would being respectful look like in the restroom? What would it look like in the classroom? What would it look like in the hallway? And this is where we want to work really hard to identify these specific skills that the students need to exhibit, and they're detailed in a process that can be observable and measurable, but that we actually can develop lesson plans around it and provide feedback to students on whether they've met that skill or they still need some correction on it. Based upon this information that your school pulled together for the expectations and rules, they pulled all the information onto a school matrix, where here they would have their identified expectations on the left-hand column, and then at the very top row they would have the specific settings and then what were their specific rules. This is just a quick summary that's really good to go in a student handbook, go in a teacher handbook. Sometimes schools post it in particular areas, but what's important is that all of it is pulled together and that we've got them positively stated. We're going to tell students what we expect them to do, and that the specific skills are observable and measurable and aligned with the school-wide expectations. When we're moving these expectations in the classroom, it's also important that they apply to classroom behavior, especially when students spend majority of their time in the classroom. So the school-wide expectations must be posted in all the classrooms. They need to be continually taught throughout the school year. One way to do that is to embed these expectations in the academic lessons, but we also want to solicit the teacher input so that they receive some, have some ownership to this process and and some input to the final version of what some of the expectations are and then how the specific rules can look like within the classroom. In the end, it was up to your school team to determine, do you come up with one set of classroom rules for every single classroom within your school, or do you still allow teachers to develop their own rules or let their students have some say in what those rules would be? If individual classrooms came up with their own set of rules, it was important that the team actually provide some guidance in how those rules needed to be. For example, aligned with the Tier 1 expectations, positively stated, didn't exceed more than 5 within the classroom, and that they were easily observable and measurable. The next critical element that the team developed is now, okay, that we've developed these expectations and rules, we know the specific behavioral skills that we want the students to demonstrate, but then how are we actually going to teach it across a school campus? So the school teams had to look at what the cultural differences are occurring on campus. We have to look at the fear of academic failure may actually drive students to avoid stressful situations, but we also need to work really hard because time out from classroom for behavior issues, we've got enough research to show that it negatively impacts a student academic engaged time. So the reasons we need to teach behavior is that oftentimes the problem behaviors occur due to a skill deficit or a performance deficit. They either don't have the skill or don't know what to do in certain situations, or they don't have a reason to perform it. Sometimes, too, the skills are not taught within the context. For example, going over what's expected in the cafeteria when you're sitting in the classroom may not translate very well by the time the students get to the classroom or get to the cafeteria. So therefore, it would be much better. Let's just move the students into the cafeteria during lunchtime, non-breakfast time, and actually start teaching them what's expected of them in that particular environment. Or oftentimes the skills are actually acquired, but they're not rewarded or encouraged consistently, so there's no reason to use them. So something that's important is that Harry Wong had stated, found that to learn a new behavior, it needs to be repeated an average of 8 times. But what's important to note is that to unlearn an old behavior and replace it with a new behavior, it must be repeated an average of 28 times. And this is going to be the majority of where our students, or as humans overall, faculty as well, we're not exempt from behavior change, is that to unlearn this old behavior and replace it with something new, it's going to take a series of 28 times. So what does this mean? This means that we need to teach, reteach, and it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time shot, but that we need to continually to do this throughout the entire school year. Your school team had looked at developing behavior curriculum, and they had a choice for 3 different ways to do this. They examined their existing initiatives that they had on your school campus to see what lesson plans they could already borrow that were created or that were already being utilized, and then work to align them with the school-wide expectations. They looked at embedding them with academic lessons, or they also looked at incorporating the lessons within the discipline process as well. So something for you as a new team members, you may want to talk to your team members to see which of these options that they chose to use. Did they search the internet? Did they create their own? Or are they using existing initiatives? Then the next step would be, how often are we teaching our students across our school campus of the behavioral expectations and rules? Something else that's important to note is not only developing lesson plans and making sure they're taught, but we also have to monitor the fidelity of how well students are taught and if they're taught appropriately. So looking at lesson times on the master schedule, it's so important that administrators make the behavior curriculum a priority. Are there samples of permanent products? Do you see posters across the school campus? Are students actually writing essays and incorporating the school-wide expectations and behavioral rules? Are pictures being created? How do we know that it is being taught and that we actually see some change across campus? So it's important. Another thing to do is to interview a sample of students. Ask them, when was the last time they were taught the behavioral expectations? When was the last time they were acknowledged for displaying the expected behavior? Ask the staff, when was the last time? Ask families what they think about it. And these are all different ways in which you can monitor the fidelity of teaching behavior across the school campus. So once we've covered our tracks in teaching the behavioral skill, the next thing to do is then we need to give them a reason to perform it. And this is dealing with our Tier 1 reward system. In the miscellaneous section of your training manual, pages 17 through 18, there's a long list of rewarding appropriate behavior and gives you different strategies and how you can do that and how it does not have to cost much money, if at all. But when we're rewarding appropriate behavior, it's serving as a teaching tool because we're providing feedback on that appropriate behavior. But it's also, when we're doing it verbally, we're also teaching the expected behavior to other students that are listening at that same time. It makes the appropriate behavior more likely to occur because we're catching the students in the act and helps to create this behavioral momentum. Helps to build positive student-teacher relationships. If you look at when you're hoping and waiting for appropriate behavior and to catch that, it starts to change the school climate. Helps to counteract negative peer influences and helps to increase internal motivation in unmotivated students. Here's a variety of different rewards that your school can access. There's not one that works for everybody, so it's important to have a variety of different rewards available across students or available for all students. For the reward recipients, it's important that students are taught how to earn the rewards. They need to also understand that every single appropriate behavior will not be rewarded, that it's not possible, but that they don't know when they're going to be acknowledged, but you try to do your best. It's also important to know that students cannot ask for a reward, that just because asking for it does not result in a reward. Again, that goes back to monitoring the fidelity of your reward system, making sure that staff understand that just because a student asks for a reward, we don't give that to them. Because again, if it's truly based upon the observable, measurable behavior, you're rewarding the student for asking for the reward as opposed to rewarding them for displaying the expected behavior. For staff, it's important, let's reward them for using the system appropriately. Let's monitor the fidelity of their system use. Are they actually using it as it's been intended? And let's solicit ongoing feedback, because the more we get ongoing feedback and input from folks, the more they're likely to use it and use it appropriately. And then for families, we can also reward families for attending parent-teacher conferences, ensuring homework's completed, signing student planners, if they're the student attendance, serving notes. I've seen schools where they actually have created a family store, so maybe they've gotten donations from Walmart or Target, and families can come shop there, or if families received a reward, it was a different color, and they could give it to their child, and it was worth double at the school. So again, just different options and how you can try to pull your stakeholders into this entire PBS process on campus. It's important that you work really hard to train your faculty and practice for providing rewards. And so there are some guidelines for providing rewards immediately after the target behavior occurs. So if a student's respectful and they displayed that specific role, it's important that you catch them right afterwards. It's also good to do it frequently after recently teaching the expectation. Or if you're having problem locations or situations, for example, a student who may have engaged in a lot of fights and actually restrained themselves and did not engage in a fight, did not use their hands as their first answer, that would be a perfect time to acknowledge them for that. Again, give them a reason to perform the new skill. But also, if there's lots of difficulties happening in the cafeteria, we may want to go in and reteach the expected behavior and then actually go in and provide rewards to students that are displaying the expected behavior in the cafeteria. The other thing we want to avoid are long delays between displaying the positive behavior and reward. Remember, it needs to be immediate. We're looking at shaping and changing behavior. We also want to avoid too long of events, like only quarterly or only semester events. So it's important to have part of a reward hierarchy. So maybe students could cash in some stuff in the classroom if they need it right away, such as computer time or a listening center or time with friends. or others may want to save up for something that you do weekly, others may want to save up for a bigger event. It's important that students should always be eligible to earn a reward, and that when you're naming the behavior and expectation observed, again, that this is being used as a teaching tool. Reward system guidelines. Overall, we've got to teach it. What behaviors will earn rewards? How and when are we going to reward them? Offer a variety, establish a hierarchy, survey the students and families for ideas what would be rewarding, make it as easy as possible, and use and share the data. Are you seeing decreases in office discipline referrals? And actually, are you seeing increases in students that are able to attend your reward events because they've been displaying the positive behavior so much? The next critical element on the benchmarks of quality and that your team had actually spent some time on, which was probably the most intensive part of the training, was the effective discipline procedures. One of the first things they had to look at is helping to come to an understanding of what behavior is. And as a quick review, behavior is anything that we say or do. It's how we respond to our environment. It typically serves as a function or a purpose in why we're doing what we're doing. But it also results in a desired outcome. It typically can be predictable, it's learned, and it can be changed. So some clear definitions of problem behaviors. Your team actually sat around the table and started to think about the problem behaviors that are occurring on your school campus. And what we discussed was that behaviors that one teacher considers disrespectful may not seem disrespectful to another teacher. And this is where we start to have a breakdown in our system. And the more that we're consistent across our system on our school campus, the better that we're going to be able to see behavioral change and actually have an impact on our school climate. So that started the team to start looking at developing a clear set or identifying a clear set of definitions for all categories on the office discipline referral form. Because again, we not only need to be looking for the same thing, but then if we're identifying the same types of behaviors and it's recorded correctly, then we're able to provide accurate interventions that actually may have a greater likelihood of having an impact on that because we identified it correctly to begin with. So then the idea was, did the faculty get trained on what's an expected behavior? If your referral form has something like insubordinate, what would that look like to be sent to the office? Another thing too they looked at is then determining the difference between what are office managed behaviors, which are typically our major behaviors that are handled the administration, and then according to your school, what should be classroom managed or teacher managed behaviors, which we often refer to as minor behaviors and handled only in the classroom. What are those types of behaviors that may occur but do not warrant losing instructional time to be sent to the office? And then another thing too is to talk about what types of behaviors fall under that crisis category. Because from this, it leads to the ABCs of behavior, which is the antecedents are all of those events that occur immediately before behavior, the actual behavior is the observable, measurable event, and then the consequences, the event or response that happens immediately after behavior that helps to maintain the problem behavior or any type of behavior to continue to occur. So when we're looking at antecedents and behaviors and how this focuses with problem behavior, for example here, the behavior is that we're having pushing in the hallway, cafeteria, and playground. One of the antecedents that they're seeing from their data is that there's limited staff presence in the hallway, and we haven't taught enough or reviewed the Tier 1 expectations in the hallway. So one of the consequences that we want to do is we want to go in and reteach the expectations. Again, it just helps to show how we use some of our Tier 1 data to make interventions systems-wide on our campus. So when we're using our ABCs to identify interventions, when I talked earlier about what PBIS is involving prevent, teach, and reinforce, this is that aspect. The antecedents, when we're changing events to prevent problem behavior, this is this prevention piece. The behavior, this is the aspect where we want to actually teach what's expected. And then consequences is dealing with how we're reinforcing behavior. How do we actually change the way behaviors continues to be maintained or stop that accidentally reinforcing problem behavior. So one way that we can prevent problem behavior is to develop positive relationships with students. Another way is ongoing teaching, rewarding of the appropriate behavior, active supervision, modifying the environment, prompting students, and providing choices. Ways that we can respond to problem behavior, which are our consequences, ways that we can change it, is help to identify the consequences in advance. This will help to increase the effectiveness and it helps to improve our data collection. But then when we're administering consequences to students, we need to make sure that the consequence that's being delivered is actually matching the severity of the offense. An example of this may be out-of-school suspension used for fighting, but then out-of-school suspension also used for gum chewing and uniform violation. We need to make sure that the consequence matches that severity of the discipline referral. We also need to make sure that we're monitoring our consequences that we're using on our school campus to ensure that they're being effective. Again, if we continue to use the same consequence over and over and problem behavior continues, we need to look at that and say, why isn't this working? We need to try something different. Different responses to problem behaviors that we can help to encourage our faculty that sometimes can help us with this is eye contact, proximity control, reminding, reteaching the expectation, redirecting the student to the task, rewarding other students around the student who is not engaged in the appropriate behavior, creating opportunities for active engagement, and again, the list goes on and on. These are various examples for you to use for that actually have some evidence base behind them. The next step in the process that your school team engaged in had to do with examining your current office discipline referral form. That would be referred to as the major form for the major types of behaviors that are dealt with by administration. Minor referral forms or minor forms are these just kind of behavior tracking forms that teachers use for accountability and to assist them in their meetings with parents. So the key was for them to examine, is there meaningful data or are there meaningful data that are coming from these referral forms? Is it actually pretty quick and efficient to be able to fill out? And then are we actually entering these data correctly at the office? So what's important is when we're looking at our referral forms, is it efficient? Is it effective for helping us identify Tier 1 behavior problems? And then what skills need to be retaught and rewarded? If we're looking at minor referral forms in the classroom, it's important that we're looking at just one behavior at a time, particularly if it's serving a different function. And again, talk to your team about this to see what they decided related to the minor behaviors and documenting these, the behavior tracking within the classroom. When it came to the office referral form for the major behaviors, they looked at do we have these areas covered of basic information, but was there additional information that needed to be included on the referral form? The next step in the process not only came up with clear definitions for the problem behaviors, came up with identifying behaviors that need to be handled in the classroom versus the office, then came up with kind of some clear consequences for problem behaviors that actually match the severity of the behavior, and then made sure that the referral form was compatible to these changes that they made in the discipline referral process. The next step then was to clearly articulate what the discipline referral process was on campus compared with how we handle the problem behaviors within the classroom versus what are the steps that are engaged in this discipline referral process for sending a student to the office. And it just summarized the whole process in a graphic flow chart. In the back of your training manual, in the miscellaneous section, there are some different variations that your team referred to. You may see that your flow chart for your school is similar to one of them that were provided. Again, what's important is that does this match the process on your school campus, and then are folks following it? Have they been trained, and are they being provided feedback on how to make sure to maintain and to complete the discipline referral process accurately? So one of the first things in this discipline referral process, as you can see, is you have to identify, is it a problem behavior? And then from there you have to determine, is it classroom managed, or is it something that needs to be administration managed, which would then go to the office? If it's classroom managed, the school had then developed their steps on how to handle it. If it's administration managed, these are the steps that this school needed to follow it. And again, this is a great summary of the discipline referral process that can be posted in schools, in the classrooms, reviewed with the students, but also is great information to go in the student handbook, go in the faculty handbook, and to be sent home to parents so that they're clear of the process as well. And again, these are just some different variations of what were available that your team may have borrowed from. Then the final step in the discipline process then is we're looking at the data analysis and evaluation. And so what's important to know is that implementation is a process. It's going to take your school team at least 1 to 2 years to establish your core curriculum for behavior, refine your discipline procedures, and then help to develop that system level support. When we're looking at overall systems change, it is anywhere from a 3 to 5 years, sometimes up to a 7-year process, depending upon the resources or lack of resources that a school may have before engaging in this process. It's also going to require ongoing monitoring of how well we're implementing the critical elements as indicated by those 10 on the benchmarks of quality, how our students are responding to our changes that we made. Do we see changes in our student outcomes? Are we actually implementing our Tier 1 interventions with some fidelity? Is there integrity of those interventions? And then do we continually use our action plan to provide accountability? This is a living document, needs to be aligned to your evaluation data, and you make adjustments and changes as you go based upon the data that are being presented at your school team. Your school team had completed a baseline benchmarks of quality on the first day of training so that they could actually identify areas that they did have in place, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but then to identify areas that they really need to build to strengthen their school-wide PBS process on their school campus. And so they may have had a low total score when they first started. Here we would look at this information and say, okay, based upon faculty commitment, we don't have it yet, so we need to survey them. We need to get their input, get their feedback. Here we don't have our expectations developed. Well, in the training, let's come to consensus. Let's develop our expectations and rules. And here you can start to see this is one way of using the data to make changes on your school campus. Here's one way that a school had taken information. They had actually surveyed their staff to say, how many do you think were the top problem behaviors last year? And then they actually brought in, based upon the office discipline referral data, and they presented this to their staff. And this is a classic example of the difference between perception here and reality. And this starts to bring people all together on the same page of why we need to start communicating the data and why it's so important that we're all on the same page on your school campus. And again, the team had some exposure on the 4-step problem-solving process, as I've discussed earlier. And what's important is that the coaches are going to receive even more information on this 4-step process. And if issues do come up, it's important that you talk to the coach and ask the coach for assistance through this process. If the coach needs further assistance, they're to go to their district coordinator that's identified in your district for additional assistance. If that district coordinator needs help, they know to go to the Florida PBS project for additional assistance. But overall of this 4-step problem-solving process is step 1, we're identifying what the problem is and doing a gap analysis between what's the difference between what you want and what you actually have on your campus. One way that we can do that is we can use our Big 5 reports, and from average referrals per day per month, problem behavior, time of day, location, student, staff, and then we've got some guiding questions to help you review that data to come to some answers to get you in that data mining mode. This second step then is, once you've identified the problem, is then let's analyze it and develop some hypotheses of why these problem behaviors are occurring. And this gives you a set of guiding questions to assist you through this. The third step in this process is the intervention design. So developing interventions based upon the hypothesis. What kinds of variables do we need to engage in to prevent the problem behavior based upon the data that we were seeing that have been coming to the office? What types of new behavior skills do we need to teach to address this problem behavior? And what do we need to do to actually reward students that are demonstrating our Tier 1 expectations? And again, these gives you just some more guiding questions for your intervention design details, and coming up with what resources are needed, who's going to implement it, when will they be implemented by, how do we know if it worked. And the final step in the four-step problem-solving process involves the response to intervention, or it's also the evaluation piece, meaning are students responding to the intervention or instruction that we put into place? Was the plan implemented with fidelity? Did the interventions work? That's where you're reviewing your discipline data to determine if it worked. Was the goal met? How accurate were you in identifying the problem and the hypotheses, and do any interventions need to be changed? If there was success with it or not success with it, it's so important you take this information and communicate that back to the faculty to let them know. So if you actually were having problems in the cafeteria and one of the interventions you came up with was to put more supervision within the cafeteria, it's so important that you then collect data to see, did that make a difference? Let the faculty know about that, because if it made a difference, that'll keep their motivation up of why they're in there providing this extra supervision. But if it didn't make a difference, it's important to get that information out. That will confirm their experience, but then also might help to generate some new ideas for how we can actually address the issues that may have been occurring in the cafeteria. Your coaches are trained on entering data, helping to collect the data at your school site with your school team, and then enter the data on PBIS, which is our PBIS Positive Behavior Support Evaluation System located at the Florida PBS website. There are 3 rounds of data that are collected from your school team annually. There's a mid-year 1, which is collected by November 1st annually, a mid-year 2 collected by March 1st, and that involves a progress monitoring tool that takes about 15 minutes of a PBS implementation checklist, also referred to as a PIC. The PIC actually has some great data as a strong indicator of how well you're going to do on the benchmarks of quality at the end of the year. Then the end of the year data that the coach is responsible in working with your team and collecting is completing the BOQ, and then collecting outcome data summaries such as the average daily attendance at your school, ISS per 100 students, which is in-school suspensions, ODRs or office discipline referrals, OSS or the out-of-school suspensions days per 100 students. From these data, we're then able to graph it to you instantly, and your team's able to use this to assist you in overall continual school improvement and to communicate to the rest of your stakeholders, families, students, faculty, district level folks, how well things are going. So this is an example from the data that are provided from the PIC and how well implementation is going at that time for the fall. Then we add in our mid-year 2, the progress monitoring. How well is your team doing on the PIC compared fall to spring? And as you can see, the light blue category is the fall and the dark blue category is the spring. And you can see there are increases on this school team from the fall to the spring on their progress monitoring tool. This would be great information to let folks know about this. Then looking at the BOQ progress monitoring, again, they have a baseline score that they had completed at the training. This is the light blue category. And then at the end of the school year, you can see the increases. From here, the school team had gone from a 10 to almost a 65. Implementation fidelity is a 70, but they had made a huge increase across the board in how well they're implementing school-wide PBIS at the Tier 1 level. There's also, because of the outcome data that we request to be submitted, such as ODRs, ISS, OSS, attendance, there's additional graphs that can be developed on PBIS and downloaded for your school team to review and compare. As you have multiple years worth of data, you can compare and analyze to see how well you're doing across school years. One of the final areas that your team worked with was then getting staff commitment and implementation. This is also known as the faculty buy-in piece, also known as consensus building. But some of those keys to staff commitment involve ensuring staff ownership, give them a compelling reason for why this behavior change is needed on campus, giving a clear vision of how those changes will impact them personally, helping to emphasize the benefits, and then teach and reward them as they're starting to implement as well. You're going to need your staff's ongoing commitment. So that's going to require your school team to actually work on maintaining at least an 80% buy-in on your school campus. The staff and administrator commitment's essential, but it's also important to know that we're dealing with PBIS. It's not a one-shot deal. It's an ongoing process. As I talked to you before, expect 3 to 5 years for full implementation. It's going to take a philosophical shift. It's not a packaged program, and expect some resistance because change can be scary. But sometimes the change is scary because folks did not have a say in how that change was going. So how can you help to obtain some ownership, and how can they actually have some say in some of the strategies that are developed across your campus? Some of the strategies for staff commitment that we've seen that have been successful are the team engaging in skits or role plays, conducting staff surveys, videos, using different technology to share. There are sample staff survey questions that are available to you off the Florida website so that you can continue to gather feedback from your faculty. I think another thing that's important too is looking at under the research section our annual data report that summarizes all of the data across Florida. And here, if you look at the data, you can see that the behavior academic link. And a lot of times, sometimes folks are scared saying, I don't have time to teach behavior because I have to teach academics and everything that we're doing with FCAT. And what's important here is that year after year, our data have indicated that focusing on behavior and teaching behavior does not impede student performance, but in fact actually helps to maintain or increase it. So that doesn't work as an excuse anymore. So again, using the data to show them. Another resource that's available to you guys can be found on this link. We also have this link available on the Florida website as well, but basically you just enter in the number of referrals you had last year, the number of referrals for this year, what's the average number of minutes the student's out of class due to the referral, and what's the average number of minutes the administrator needs to process that referral, and it will give you these graphs. So it'll help you move into time regained, which again is that cost benefit worksheet so that folks can understand, oh, we're engaging in these extra disciplinary measures or these changes in order to get more time back within the classroom. So how do we get everybody on the same page? Is communications absolutely essential prior to and during your implementation, which is an ongoing process. But something too I want your team to think about, and you may want to ask them if they've had a chance to develop any substitute packets or packets for volunteers that come to the school. How will new folks that come onto your school campus, even new students, find out about the expectations and rules, the rewards, the discipline flow chart, consequence grid, referral forms. Here on the slide it talks about sub-bucks. That's related to different colored reward dollars that are specific just for substitutes, so that if they actually deliver them, and again it's important to have a particular little script so that they know what to say in delivering the reward, but if a student receives them it may be worth double because they received it from a substitute. And then on top of it, another stakeholder that you need to look at is how do you solicit your family input. Input on the PBIS critical elements, but then also obtaining their input in different ways that you can obtain their input, and not only let them know what's happening, but get ideas from them too and how they can get involved in PBS on your school campus. Some of the next steps, hopefully your team is meeting at least monthly, but that obtaining staff, faculty, and student input and commitment, it needs to happen initially, but it also is ongoing. Addressing all the elements on your PBS action plan that your team developed, making sure that action plan continues to be pulled out and re-examined during each meeting. Assemble all the activities and products into kind of one big product book. Coaches were provided a wristband that had all of the activities, action plans, documents in Word files so that they could actually, it could be typed up into a clean versions. Just know that those may need to be revised each year based upon the feedback of your school. And so how do you assemble everything into one product so that it doesn't get lost? Making sure that you're teaching everyone. Again, I can't emphasize enough how much of a resource the Florida PBS website is, so you can pull that information on there and keep checking on your progress. So there's ongoing collaboration not only with the Florida PBS project, but the PSRTI project, as well as the National Technical Assistance Center on Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, also known as PBIS, and collaboration with the Association for Positive Behavior Support. And these are the links to those as well. Also, if you wanted to get connected, Florida PBS, we are on Facebook and we're on Twitter. So these are the specific addresses. And again, the specific links and contact information for our project, the National Center, and the Association on PBS, which is also known as APBS. If you cannot locate this information, it's always important to know that on the very front cover of your training manual is all of this information. So I hope that this was useful to you. Again, if you have any questions, I recommend as a new team member that you go directly to your team later and or coach to talk to them. If your coaches are unable to answer your specific questions, please ask them to take that. They know to take that to their district coordinator, and if the district coordinators are unable to answer that, they come to us to ask and to gain the information. But congratulations to joining the team, and the best of luck to you. Thanks.